The October rain fell heavy on the streets of Franklin, Tennessee, creating small rivers on the sidewalks and transforming the golden autumn leaves into a slippery carpet. The cold droplets drummed against the windshield of the worn pickup truck as it slowly made its way through the quiet downtown area, its headlights cutting through the gray afternoon mist. Behind the wheel sat a man in his early 60s, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with the familiarity of someone who had traveled countless miles on America's highways. His face bore the lines of time and experience, framed by graying hair that peeked out from beneath a simple black baseball cap. A worn denim jacket hung loosely over his broad shoulders, and his boots showed the scuffs and wear of a working man's life. Garth Brooks had been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, leaving behind the bright lights and roaring crowds of his latest concert in Atlanta. The tour had been grueling, 43 cities in 3 months, each night pouring his heart and soul onto the stage for thousands of devoted fans. But tonight, he just wanted to be anonymous, to find a quiet place to rest without the usual fanfare that accompanied his name. The Grand Magnolia Hotel stood like a beacon through the rain, its elegant colonial facade and warm yellow lights promising comfort and respite. Garth had chosen Franklin specifically because it was far enough from Nashville to avoid the music industry crowd, yet close enough to feel like home. He pulled into the parking lot, noting the collection of luxury cars, Mercedes, BMWs, and Lexuses that filled the spaces near the entrance. As he stepped out of his truck, the rain immediately began soaking through his jacket. He pulled his cap lower over his eyes and hurried toward the ornate double doors, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the hotel's elegant lighting. The lobby hit him with a wave of warmth and the subtle scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers. The interior was everything the exterior had promised. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine, crystal chandeliers casting dancing lights across cream-colored walls adorned with oil paintings of southern landscapes. Leather chairs and mahogany tables were arranged in intimate conversation areas, while a grand staircase curved majestically toward the upper floors. Behind the reception desk stood a young woman with auburn hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell, and her smile was genuine as she looked up from her computer screen. She was probably in her mid-20s, with kind eyes and the sort of southern grace that made visitors feel immediately welcome. "Good evening, sir," Sarah said warmly, her Tennessee accent soft and welcoming. "How can I help you tonight?" "I'd like a room, please," Garth replied, pulling off his wet cap and running a hand through his damp hair. "Something quiet, if you have it." "Of course! Let me see what we have available." Sarah's fingers danced across the keyboard. "We have a lovely room on the 3rd floor, king bed, with a view of the courtyard. It's nice and peaceful back there." "That sounds perfect," Garth said, reaching for his wallet. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, and he pulled out a credit card and driver's license. Just then, the sound of sharp footsteps echoed across the marble floor. A man in his 40s approached the desk with an air of self-importance that preceded him like a storm cloud. Richard Blackwood was impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His dark hair was slicked back with precision, and his cold blue eyes seemed to assess everything around him with calculating disapproval. "Miss Mitchell," Richard's voice cut through the warm atmosphere like a blade, "what seems to be the delay here?" Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "No delay, Mr. Blackwood. I'm just checking in this gentleman." Richard's gaze fell upon Garth with unconcealed disdain, taking in the worn denim jacket, the faded jeans, and the scuffed boots that were leaving small puddles on the pristine marble floor. His expression soured further when he noticed the baseball cap in Garth's hand, now dripping with rainwater. "Sir," Richard addressed Garth with barely concealed contempt, "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. The Grand Magnolia maintains certain standards of dress and decorum. We don't typically accommodate transients. Garth blinked, taken aback by the hostility. I'm sorry? Your attire, Richard gestured dismissively at Garth's clothes, is not appropriate for our establishment. We cater to a distinguished clientele, and I'm afraid you don't meet our standards. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment. Mr. Blackwood, I was just... Miss Mitchell, please step aside. I'll handle this. Richard's tone brooked no argument. He turned back to Garth with a cold smile. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. There are several motels down Highway 31 that might be more suitable for someone of your means. The lobby had grown quiet, and Garth became aware that other guests were beginning to stare. An elderly couple near the fireplace whispered to each other, while a businessman in an expensive suit shook his head in disapproval. Though whether at Garth's appearance or Richard's behavior wasn't clear. I have money, Garth said quietly, holding up his credit card. I just want a room for the night. Richard laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the marble walls. Sir, this isn't a homeless shelter. The Grand Magnolia charges $300 a night for our standard rooms. I highly doubt that someone who can't afford proper attire can manage our rates. The humiliation stung deeper than Garth had expected. After decades of performing for millions, of having his music touch hearts across the world, to be judged so harshly based on his appearance felt like a slap in the face. But more than that, it reminded him of his early days, when he was just a struggling musician trying to make it in Nashville, facing similar prejudice from people who couldn't see past the surface. Please, Garth said, his voice steady despite the frustration building inside him. I've been driving all day. I'm tired, wet, and I just need a place to sleep. I can pay whatever your rates are. Security! Richard called out, his voice carrying across the lobby. We have someone who needs to be escorted from the premises. A large man in a blue uniform appeared from a side corridor. Thomas Jefferson Wilson, no relation to the president, as he often joked, was in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed at odds with his imposing frame. He'd worked security at various establishments around Franklin for 20 years. And something about this situation didn't sit right with him. What's the problem, Mr. Blackwood? Thomas asked, his voice careful and measured. This man is loitering in our lobby. Please escort him out immediately. Thomas looked at Garth, taking in his quiet dignity despite the obvious exhaustion. There was something familiar about the man, though he couldn't quite place it. Sir, is there a problem here? I just wanted a room, Garth replied softly. I have the money to pay for it. Sarah stepped forward, her professional composure cracking. Mr. Blackwood, he has a valid credit card and ID. There's no reason we can't... Miss Mitchell! Richard's voice was sharp with warning. Remember who signs your paychecks. This establishment has a reputation to maintain, and I will not have it tarnished by undesirable elements. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Even Thomas shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Several other guests had stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Garth felt the familiar weight of judgment that he'd carried as a young man trying to break into the music business. How many doors had been closed to him because he didn't look the part? How many people had dismissed him before ever hearing his voice or learning his story? Fine, Garth said finally, putting his credit card back in his wallet. I understand. He turned to leave, but Sarah's voice stopped him. Wait, please. Sir, I'm sorry about this. This isn't how we usually... It's okay, Garth said gently, giving her a sad smile. Some folks judge a book by its cover. That's their choice to make. As he walked toward the door, his boots echoing in the sudden silence of the lobby. Garth felt every eye upon him. The rain was still falling heavily outside, and he dreaded the thought of driving through the storm to find another place to stay. But more than the physical discomfort, he felt the deep sadness that came from witnessing the worst in human nature. Behind him, Richard Blackwood straightened his tie with satisfaction, already turning his attention back to his papers. In his mind, he'd done exactly what needed to be done, protected the hotel's reputation, and maintained the standards that kept their distinguished clientele happy. But as Garth pushed through the doors back into the cold October rain, he couldn't have known that his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had already begun to work on the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And sometimes, the most powerful moments come not from grand gestures, but from simple human decency in the face of adversity. The rain seemed to fall harder as Garth made his way back to his pickup truck, each drop feeling like a small reminder of the humiliation he'd just endured. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, not starting the engine, just listening to the rhythmic patter against the windshield. The warm lights of the Grand Magnolia Hotel glowed mockingly through the storm, a beacon he was apparently not worthy to approach. Inside the hotel lobby, an uncomfortable silence had settled over the elegant space. Sarah Mitchell stood behind the reception desk, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process what had just happened. In her 3 years working at the Grand Magnolia, she'd never seen Mr. Blackwood treat anyone so cruelly, and the injustice of it sat like a stone in her stomach. "Get back to work, Miss Mitchell," Richard's voice cut through her thoughts. "We have actual guests to attend to." But Sarah couldn't shake the image of the quiet dignity in the stranger's eyes, or the way he'd accepted the rejection with such grace. There had been something almost familiar about him, though she couldn't place what it was. His voice had carried a warmth and depth that suggested someone used to speaking to crowds, and his hands, she'd noticed his hands when he'd reached for his wallet, bore the calluses of someone who played guitar. Near the fireplace, Margaret and Harold Patterson, both in their 70s, sat in stunned silence. They'd been regular guests at the Grand Magnolia for 15 years, celebrating their anniversary here every October. Margaret, a retired school principal, had built her career on judging people by their character rather than their appearance, and what she'd just witnessed went against everything she believed in. "Harold," she whispered to her husband, her voice tight with emotion, "that was disgraceful." Harold Patterson, a retired mechanic who'd worked with his hands his entire life, nodded grimly. He'd worn clothes similar to the stranger's for 40 years and knew the sting of being judged for honest work attire. "That man had more class in his little finger than Blackwood has in his whole body," he murmured back. Across the lobby, Thomas Wilson remained near the reception desk, ostensibly returning to his patrol, but actually watching the aftermath of the confrontation. Something about the whole situation bothered him deeply. The stranger had carried himself with a quiet confidence that didn't match the picture Richard Blackwood had tried to paint. And there was definitely something familiar about him. The voice, the posture, even the way he'd tipped his cap to Sarah when apologizing for the water on the floor. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas said carefully, "that gentleman seemed perfectly respectable to me." "Are you sure, Mr. "Wilson," Richard interrupted sharply, "I don't pay you to question my decisions. The Grand Magnolia has standards, and I intend to maintain them. That man was clearly not our type of clientele." Thomas nodded slowly, but said nothing more. He'd dealt with enough people in his 20 years of security work to recognize genuine character when he saw it, and that quiet stranger had it in spades. Richard Blackwood, for all his expensive suits and superior attitude, was lacking something essential that the shabby traveler had possessed in abundance. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her work. Every few minutes, she glanced toward the lobby doors, half hoping the man would return, half dreading another confrontation. She'd grown up in Franklin, raised by her grandmother after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Her grandmother, Ruby Mitchell, had taught her to treat everyone with kindness and respect, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. "Appearances can fool you, honey," her grandmother used to say while they worked in their small garden behind their modest house. The most beautiful flowers sometimes have the deepest roots, and the plainest package might hold the greatest treasure. Jones? As the evening wore on, the lobby gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the tension from the earlier confrontation lingered like smoke in the air. Richard Blackwood had retreated to his office, satisfied that he'd handled the situation appropriately, while the hotel guests went about their evening activities, some heading to dinner, others settling in with books or newspapers by the fireplace. But outside in the parking lot, Garth Brooks sat in his truck with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking quietly to his manager. "No, Bob, I'm fine," Garth said, his voice tired but steady. "Just a little reminder that fame doesn't follow you everywhere. And maybe that's not such a bad thing." Bob Jenkins had been Garth's manager for over a decade, and he could hear the weariness in his client's voice that went beyond simple fatigue. "What happened?" "Nothing I haven't dealt with before," Garth replied, watching the hotel through the rain-streaked windshield. "Just ran into someone who reminded me that kindness isn't always the default setting for some people." "You sure you don't want me to make a call?" "I know the owner of that place, actually. Patricia Hawthorne's a good woman. She'd be horrified if she knew—" "No," Garth said firmly. "Let it be. Sometimes the best lessons come from the hardest moments." As they spoke, Sarah Mitchell was making a decision that would change the course of the evening. She'd been thinking about the stranger for the past hour, and something her grandmother had always told her kept echoing in her mind. "When you see injustice, child, you don't stand by and let it happen. You do what's right, even if it costs you something." During her break, Sarah slipped out the back exit and walked around to the parking lot. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, and she could see the pickup truck still sitting under one of the parking lot lights. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle the occupant. Garth saw her coming and rolled down his window. "Hello again," he said gently. "Sir, I wanted to apologize," Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly. "What happened in there? That's not who we are. That's not who I am. Mr. Blackwood was wrong, and I should have stood up to him." Garth studied her face in the soft glow of the parking lot light. She couldn't have been much older than his youngest daughter, and her genuine distress over the situation touched something deep in his heart. "You don't have anything to apologize for, miss. You were nothing but kind to me." "But I let him. I should have—" Sarah struggled to find the words. "You're young," Garth said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes standing up to people in authority takes practice. The important thing is that you know it was wrong. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." They talked for a few more minutes, and as they did, Sarah found herself drawn to this stranger's wisdom and kindness. There was something about him that reminded her of her late father, a quiet strength, and an ability to make her feel heard and valued. She wanted to do something to make up for the evening's injustice, but she wasn't sure what. "There's a diner about 2 miles down the road," she finally offered. "Mel's Place. It's not fancy, but the coffee's good and they're open all night. The owner, Melody Thompson, is a friend of mine. She'd treat you right." "I appreciate that," Garth said. "You're very kind." After Sarah returned to the hotel, Garth sat for a few more minutes, thinking about the evening's events. The encounter had stung, but it had also reminded him of something important: how it felt to be judged unfairly, and how much courage it took for people like Sarah to show kindness in the face of authority. He started his truck and pulled out of the Grand Magnolia's parking lot, heading toward the diner Sarah had mentioned. But as he drove through the quiet streets of Franklin, he found himself thinking not about his own wounded pride, but about the young woman who'd risked her job to apologize to a stranger, and the security guard who'd clearly been uncomfortable with his boss's behavior. Sometimes, Garth reflected, the most important moments weren't the ones on stage in front of thousands of people. Sometimes they happened in hotel lobbies and parking lots, between strangers who might never meet again, but who touched each other's lives in ways that mattered far more than applause or recognition. The lights of Mel's place appeared through the drizzle like a warm promise. And Garth Brooks, international superstar, but tonight just a weary traveler seeking shelter from the storm, pulled into the parking lot, ready to discover what other lessons the evening might have in store. Mel's place sat like a warm beacon in the Franklin night, its neon sign casting a cheerful pink glow through the gentle rain. The diner was a classic American establishment. Chrome stools along a Formica counter, red vinyl booths, and the kind of checkered floor that had seen decades of stories unfold over coffee and pie. Through the large windows, Garth could see the comforting glow of warm light and the silhouettes of a few late-night patrons. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and immediately he felt the difference from the hotel lobby. Where the Grand Magnolia had been all cold marble and intimidating elegance, Mel's place embraced visitors with the scent of fresh coffee, bacon grease, and apple pie. The walls were covered with local photographs, vintage advertisements, and the kind of memorabilia that told the story of a community. "Well, honey, you look like you've had a night of it," came a warm voice from behind the counter. Melody Thompson was a woman in her mid-40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and laugh lines that spoke of someone who'd found joy despite life's challenges. Her apron was stained with the honest work of cooking, and her smile was genuine as she looked up from wiping down the counter. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a mug. "That would be perfect," Garth replied, settling onto one of the counter stools. The vinyl was worn smooth by countless customers, but it was clean and comfortable. Melody poured steaming coffee into a heavy ceramic mug, the kind that held heat and felt substantial in your hands. "I'm Melody, but everyone calls me Mel. This is my place." "Thank you, Mel. Garth paused for a moment, then simply said, "I'm Gary." It wasn't entirely a lie. Garth's given name was Troyle Garth Brooks, and he'd gone by Gary in his younger days. Tonight, he just wanted to be a regular person, not a celebrity. "Well, Gary, what brings you out on a night like this?" Mel asked, refilling the sugar dispenser with practiced efficiency. "Just traveling through," Garth replied, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Had a bit of trouble finding a place to stay." Mel's eyebrows raised slightly. "The Grand Magnolia giving you trouble?" "I'm surprised. They usually—" She stopped mid-sentence, studying Garth's face more carefully. What happened? There was something in her tone that invited confidence, and Garth found himself telling her about the evening's events. He kept the details simple, not wanting to sound like he was complaining. But Mel's expression grew increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "Richard Blackwood," she said when he finished, shaking her head in disgust. "That man's got ice water in his veins and dollar signs where his heart should be. I'm sorry you had to deal with that." "It's not your fault," Garth said. "Some people just see the world differently." Differently. Mel's voice rose slightly, causing the other customers, an elderly man reading a newspaper and a young couple sharing dessert, to glance over. "Gary, what he did was just plain wrong. Nobody deserves to be treated like that." She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "You know, I've lived in Franklin my whole life, 46 years. And I've seen that hotel change hands 3 times. Patricia Hawthorne owns it now. She's good people, grew up here just like me. But she hired Blackwood as manager about 2 years ago. And ever since, that place has gotten colder and meaner. Garth sipped his coffee, which was excellent, rich and strong without being bitter. You know the owner? Patricia? Sure do. We went to high school together. She'd be mortified if she knew what happened tonight. That hotel was her daddy's pride and joy, and she's tried to maintain his legacy of hospitality. But Blackwood, Mel shook her head. He thinks hospitality means kissing up to people with money and looking down on everyone else. The bell chimed again, and Thomas Wilson walked in, shaking raindrops from his jacket. He nodded to Mel, then stopped short when he saw Garth sitting at the counter. "Well, I'll be," Thomas said quietly. "You're the gentleman from the hotel." "Hello again," Garth replied, turning to face the security guard. Thomas approached slowly, his expression apologetic. "I wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened back there. That wasn't right. What Mr. Blackwood did." "You don't need to apologize," Garth said. "You were just doing your job." "No," Thomas said firmly, settling onto the stool next to Garth. "My job is to keep people safe and maintain order. It's not to help someone humiliate a decent person who just wanted a room for the night." Mel poured Thomas a cup of coffee without being asked. "The usual, Thomas?" "Thanks, Mel." Thomas wrapped his hands around the mug, mirroring Garth's posture. 20 years I've been doing security work around this town, and I can usually tell within 5 minutes if someone's going to be trouble. You, sir, were clearly no trouble at all." The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the night air still carried the fresh, clean scent of a storm washing the world clean. "You know what bothers me most?" Thomas said eventually. "It's not just that he was rude to you. It's that he did it in front of everyone, like he was proud of it. Like being cruel was something to show off." Garth nodded thoughtfully. Some people measure their worth by how much they think they're better than others. It's a sad way to live. "Where are you from, Gary?" Mel asked, settling in for conversation. The diner was quiet enough that she could afford to chat. "Oklahoma originally," Garth replied, which was true. "Been traveling a lot for work lately." "What kind of work?" Garth hesitated for a moment. "Music," he said finally. "Musician, huh?" Thomas's eyes lit up with interest. "What kind of music?" "Country, mostly." Mel grinned. "Well, you came to the right place. Franklin's got music in its bones. You play around Nashville much?" "Some," Garth said carefully. He was walking a fine line between honesty and anonymity. "I used to play a little guitar myself," Thomas said. "Nothing professional, just church and family gatherings. There's something about music that brings people together, you know? Doesn't matter where you come from or what you look like. If you can make music that touches people's hearts, that's all that matters." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from the challenges of small-town life to the power of music to heal and unite. Garth found himself genuinely enjoying the company of these 2 strangers who'd shown him more kindness in one evening than he'd received from countless industry executives over the years. As the night wore on, Mel mentioned that she had a small apartment above the diner that she sometimes rented to travelers. "It's nothing fancy," she said, "but it's clean and warm, and you're welcome to it for the night. No charge." Consider it Franklin's way of apologizing for the Grand Magnolia's bad manners. Garth was touched by the offer, but insisted on paying. "You've already done more than enough, just by being kind." "Nonsense," Mel said firmly. "My grandmother always said that hospitality was a sacred duty. When someone needs shelter, you provide it if you can. That's how communities are supposed to work." As Thomas prepared to head back to finish his shift at the hotel, He shook Garth's hand warmly. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Gary. I hope the rest of your travels treat you better than tonight did." "Thank you," Garth replied. "And thank you for being a voice of reason back there. It meant more than you know." After Thomas left, Mel showed Garth to the small apartment above the diner. It was indeed simple: a bed, a chair, a small bathroom, and a window that looked out over Franklin's quiet main street. But it was clean and welcoming. And after the events at the Grand Magnolia, it felt like a palace. "Breakfast starts at 6 if you're interested," Mel said from the doorway. "Best pancakes in Tennessee, or so my customers tell me." "I'll definitely take you up on that," Garth said. As Mel headed back downstairs, Garth sat on the edge of the bed and looked out the window at the quiet town. The streetlights cast gentle pools of light along the empty sidewalks, and the rain had left everything looking clean and refreshed. He thought about the evening's contrasts, the cold rejection at the Grand Magnolia and the warm acceptance at Mel's place. The same man, wearing the same clothes, had been treated as both an undesirable vagrant and a welcomed guest. The difference hadn't been in him, it had been in the hearts of the people he'd encountered. Tomorrow, he would reveal who he was. But tonight, he was just Gary, a traveler who'd learned once again that kindness was the most precious currency in the world, and that it could be found in the most unexpected places. As he settled in for the night, Garth Brooks smiled for the first time since entering Franklin. Sometimes the best concerts weren't the ones on stage. Sometimes they were the quiet symphonies of human decency played out in diners and parking lots, one note of kindness at a time. The morning sun painted Franklin's main street in shades of gold and amber, transforming the previous night's storm-soaked town into something that looked like a postcard from the heart of America. Garth woke to the sound of birds singing outside his window and the gentle clatter of breakfast preparation drifting up from Mel's place below. He dressed in the same clothes from the night before, they were all he had with him, and made his way downstairs to find the diner bustling with morning activity. The breakfast crowd was a mix of local workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, elderly couples enjoying their morning ritual, and a few families with children chattering excitedly about weekend plans. "Morning, Gary," Mel called from behind the counter, her voice carrying the cheerfulness of someone who genuinely loved her work. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks," Garth replied truthfully, settling onto the same stool he'd occupied the night before. Mel poured him coffee without asking and slid a menu across the counter. "What can I get started for you?" As Garth studied the menu, he became aware of conversation at a nearby booth. Margaret and Harold Patterson sat across from each other, their voices low but intense. "I couldn't sleep all night thinking about it," Margaret was saying to her husband. "The way that poor man was treated, it was unconscionable." "40 years I worked at Patterson's garage," Harold replied, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. 40 years of coming home dirty, with grease under my fingernails and oil stains on my clothes. I know what it's like to have people look at you and make assumptions." Margaret nodded firmly. "I'm calling Patricia Hawthorne this morning. She needs to know what's happening in her hotel." Garth glanced over at the elderly couple, recognizing them from the hotel lobby. The woman caught his eye and gave him a small, apologetic smile. He nodded back, touched by their concern for a stranger. "You know," Mel said quietly, following his gaze, "word's getting around town about what happened at the Grand Magnolia last night. Harold and Margaret have been coming in here for Saturday morning breakfast for 15 years, and I've never seen them so worked up about anything." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Thomas Wilson stopped by about an hour ago on his way home. Said he couldn't stop thinking about the whole situation. He's planning to have a talk with Patricia Hawthorne, too." Garth felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. These people, complete strangers, were taking his mistreatment personally, as if an injustice against one was an injustice against all. "Mel," he said carefully, "would you be able to get me Patricia Hawthorne's number? I think it's time I had a conversation with her myself." "Of course," Mel replied. "But Gary, you might want to know that she's actually coming in this morning. Every Saturday for the past 3 years, she meets her daughter here for breakfast. They should be here within the hour." As if summoned by their conversation, the bell above the door chimed, and Thomas Wilson entered, looking tired but determined. He'd clearly gone home, showered, and changed clothes, but his expression carried the weight of a sleepless night. "Morning, Mel," he said, then nodded to Garth. "Gary, I was hoping I'd find you here." "Rough night?" Mel asked, pouring Thomas coffee. "Couldn't sleep," Thomas admitted, settling beside Garth at the counter. "Kept thinking about what happened at the hotel. Gary, I owe you another apology." "Thomas, you don't—" "Yes, I do," Thomas interrupted. "I've been doing security work for 20 years, and I know the difference between protecting people and enabling bullying. What Blackwood did was bullying, pure and simple, and I should have stopped it." He took a long sip of coffee, gathering his thoughts. "I called Patricia Hawthorne this morning, left a message with her answering service. That hotel was her father's legacy, and she's worked hard to maintain its reputation. She needs to know that her manager is damaging everything she's built." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more customers, a construction worker still in his mud-splattered boots, a nurse finishing her night shift, and a young mother with 2 small children. The diner hummed with the comfortable energy of a community gathering place. "You know what I love about this place?" Thomas said, gesturing around the diner. "Everybody's welcome. Doesn't matter what you do for a living, what you're wearing, or how much money you have in your pocket. Mel treats everyone the same." "That's how my daddy raised me," Mel said, wiping down the counter. "He used to say, 'Melody, honey, every person who walks through that door is carrying their own story, their own struggles. Your job isn't to judge, it's to feed them and make them feel human again.'" Garth found himself deeply moved by the wisdom in those words. How many times in his career had he encountered people who treated him differently once they learned who he was? The fawning attention of industry executives, the sudden friendship of people who'd previously ignored him. It was all part of the celebrity experience. But here, as Gary the Traveler, he was experiencing something rarer and more precious: unconditional human kindness. At exactly 9:30, the bell chimed again, and a woman in her 50s entered with a younger woman who was clearly her daughter. Patricia Hawthorne carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to responsibility. But her face was troubled. She'd obviously received Thomas's message. She looked around the diner, her eyes settling on Thomas at the counter. "Thomas," she called softly. Thomas turned, then stood immediately. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I didn't expect to see you so soon. Your message was disturbing," Patricia said, approaching the counter. Her daughter followed, looking curious about the urgency that had brought them here earlier than usual. Patricia was an elegant woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that reminded Garth of his own mother. Her daughter, Jennifer, appeared to be in her late 20s, with the same graceful bearing but a more modern edge. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Thomas began, "I want you to meet the gentleman I told you about. Gary, this is Patricia Hawthorne, owner of the Grand Magnolia." Patricia turned to Garth, and he could see the genuine distress in her eyes. "Sir, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what happened at my hotel last night. Thomas told me about Mr. Blackwood's behavior, and I am absolutely appalled." Garth stood and extended his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hawthorne. And please, don't apologize for something you didn't do." "But it happened in my hotel, under my roof," Patricia said firmly. That makes me responsible. My father built the Grand Magnolia on the principle that every guest deserves respect and hospitality, regardless of their station in life. What Mr. Blackwood did goes against everything my family has stood for. Jennifer stepped forward. Mom's been on the phone all morning trying to reach you. She's been sick about this since Thomas called. I've been here, Garth said simply. Mel was kind enough to provide a room for the night. Of course she was, Patricia said, glancing affectionately at Mel. Melody Thompson has more hospitality in her little finger than my manager apparently has in his entire body. The group settled into a large booth, with Mel joining them after ensuring her other customers were taken care of. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Garth had experienced in years. Genuine, heartfelt, and completely without pretense. I need to tell you something, Patricia said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Richard Blackwood came highly recommended from a hotel chain in Atlanta. His references were impeccable, his credentials impressive. But I'm beginning to think I confused efficiency with character. He's been making changes, Thomas added. Little things at first, new policies about dress codes, stricter guidelines about who could use the lobby facilities. I thought it was just about maintaining standards, but last night showed me it was really about creating barriers. Jennifer shook her head. A hotel should welcome people, not exclude them. Grandpa used to say that the measure of true hospitality was how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you in return. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man, Garth said. He was, Patricia replied softly. He started with nothing, just a dream and a willingness to work hard. He understood what it meant to be looked down on because of your circumstances. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from the changing nature of hospitality to the importance of treating all people with dignity. Garth found himself sharing stories from his travels, though he carefully avoided any details that might reveal his identity. You know, Patricia said eventually, I've made a decision. Mr. Blackwood will be terminated this morning. What he did last night was unforgivable, but more than that, it showed me that his values are fundamentally incompatible with what the Grand Magnolia represents. That's a big decision, Garth said carefully. It's the right decision, Patricia replied firmly, and I want to make this right with you personally. Would you consider staying at the hotel tonight? As my guest, of course. I'd like to show you the hospitality you should have received last night. Garth was touched by the offer, but he also recognized that the moment for revelation was approaching. These people had shown him extraordinary kindness as Gary the Traveler. Now he needed to trust them with the truth about who he really was. Mrs. Hawthorne, he said slowly, there's something I need to tell you. Something I probably should have mentioned last night. The table grew quiet, everyone sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. My name isn't really Gary, Garth continued. Well, it is, but it's not the name most people know me by. He reached into his wallet and pulled out his driver's license, sliding it across the table to Patricia. Her eyes widened as she read the name, then looked up at his face with dawning recognition. Oh my God, she whispered. You're Garth Brooks, he said simply. The silence that followed was profound. Jennifer's mouth fell open. Thomas blinked several times as if trying to process the information. And Mel stared at him with the expression of someone whose worldview had just shifted dramatically. You're Garth Brooks, Patricia repeated, her voice barely audible. The Garth Brooks. And Richard Blackwood threw you out of my hotel because of your clothes. I'm afraid so, Garth said with a gentle smile. Thomas suddenly laughed, not with humor, but with the bitter irony of the situation. Do you realize what this means? Blackwood just humiliated one of the biggest stars in country music. When this gets out, it doesn't have to get out, Garth said quickly. I'm not interested in revenge or publicity. What happened last night was about something bigger than who I am professionally. But people need to know, Jennifer said, her voice rising with indignation. They need to know how you were treated. Do they? Garth asked gently. Or do they need to know that when injustice happens, good people stand up to make it right? Because that's what all of you have done. He looked around the table at these people who had become friends without knowing his fame or fortune. Last night, I wasn't Garth Brooks, the entertainer. I was just a tired traveler looking for a place to rest. And some of you judged me for my character, while others judged me for my appearance. That's a lesson worth learning, regardless of who I turned out to be. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the revelation of his identity, but the deeper implications of what had transpired. You're right, she said finally. This isn't about celebrity. It's about basic human decency. Exactly, Garth replied. And the beautiful thing is, all of you passed that test with flying colors, without knowing there was a test at all. The morning sun had climbed higher, filling the diner with warm, golden light. Outside, Franklin was going about its Saturday business. Children riding bicycles, couples walking hand in hand, families enjoying the beautiful autumn day. It was the kind of scene that represented the best of small-town America, and Garth felt privileged to have experienced it from the inside. So what happens now? Mel asked, speaking for the first time since the revelation. Now, Garth said, we have breakfast, and I get to enjoy the company of some of the finest people I've met in a very long time. After that, well, we'll see what the day brings. But even as he spoke, Garth knew that this morning would mark the beginning of something special. Not just because his identity had been revealed, but because he had found something rare and precious. A group of people who had seen past appearances to the human being underneath. And in a world that often seemed obsessed with surface impressions and shallow judgments, that was worth more than all the gold records and sold-out concerts in the world. The revelation of Garth's identity had transformed the atmosphere in Mel's place, but not in the way anyone might have expected. Instead of star-struck awe or fawning attention, there was a deeper sense of understanding, as if puzzle pieces were finally falling into place. I feel like such a fool, Thomas said, shaking his head. I knew there was something familiar about you. Your voice, the way you carried yourself. But I never imagined. You're not a fool, Garth replied firmly. You treated me with respect and kindness before you knew who I was. That says everything about your character. Jennifer, who had been quietly absorbing the news, suddenly straightened up. Mom, do you realize what almost happened? If word of this gets out, if people learn that the Grand Magnolia turned away Garth Brooks because of how he was dressed, it could destroy the hotel's reputation. Patricia had gone very pale, clearly thinking the same thing. The Grand Magnolia wasn't just a business, it was her family's legacy, built over 3 generations. The thought of that legacy being tarnished by one man's prejudice and poor judgment was almost unbearable. I'm not interested in destroying anyone's reputation, Garth said gently, reading the distress in Patricia's face. What happened last night was unfortunate, but it's also provided an opportunity, a chance to make things right, and maybe teach some important lessons along the way. What do you mean? Patricia asked. Garth leaned back in the booth, his expression thoughtful. Well, I've been thinking about this all morning. What if we use this situation to create something positive? What if instead of this being a story about prejudice and poor judgment, it became a story about redemption and the power of community? He looked around the table at the faces of these people who had shown him such kindness. Each of you responded to last night's events in a way that honored your values. Thomas, you risked your job to apologize to someone you thought was just a traveler. Mel, you opened your home to a stranger. Patricia, you're willing to fire a manager to preserve your principles. And Jennifer, you're outraged by injustice even when it doesn't affect you personally. Those are the actions that matter, Garth continued, not the original mistake, but how people responded to it. Margaret and Harold Patterson, who had been listening to the conversation from their nearby booth, approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, "but did I hear correctly? Are you really Garth Brooks?" Garth smiled and stood to shake their hands. "Yes, ma'am. And you're the couple from the hotel last night. I remember you." "We've been talking about what happened all morning," Harold said, his weathered face earnest. "It wasn't right, and we wanted to do something about it." "Margaret was planning to call Mrs. Hawthorne," Harold continued, "and I was going to write a letter to the local newspaper. We couldn't just let it go." "You see," Garth said, turning back to the others, "this is what I'm talking about. Good people don't stand by when they see injustice. They act." Patricia wiped tears from her eyes. "I still can't believe Richard Blackwood did this, and I can't believe I didn't see his true character before now." "Sometimes people hide their true nature well," Garth said. "But crisis has a way of revealing who people really are. Last night revealed the worst in Mr. Blackwood, but it also revealed the best in everyone else." Mel refilled everyone's coffee, her expression thoughtful. "So, what's your idea? You mentioned creating something positive out of this." Garth smiled, and for the first time since revealing his identity, a hint of his performer's charisma showed through. "What if we turned this into a concert? Right here in Franklin. A celebration of the values that this community represents. Kindness, hospitality, standing up for what's right." The table erupted in surprised murmurs and excited whispers. "A concert?" Jennifer asked, her eyes wide. "Here, in Franklin. Why not?" Garth replied. "Every town deserves good music, and this town has shown me something special. I'd like to give something back." Thomas leaned forward, his excitement building. "There's a park downtown with a natural amphitheater. The town uses it for festivals and outdoor events. It could probably hold a few thousand people. And it wouldn't cost the town anything," Patricia added, catching on to the idea. "We could make it a free concert, a gift to the community." "Exactly," Garth said. "But more than that, we could make it a teaching moment. Show people that real character isn't about what you wear or where you come from, but about how you treat others." Margaret clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with tears. "Oh my, this would be the most wonderful thing to happen to Franklin in, well, maybe ever." "But first," Garth said, his expression growing more serious, "we need to deal with the situation at the hotel. Mrs. Hawthorne, you mentioned terminating Mr. Blackwood." Patricia nodded firmly. "It has to be done. What he did was inexcusable." "I agree," Garth said, "but I'd like to be there when it happens. Not for revenge, but to make sure he understands exactly what he cost himself and the hotel." "You want to confront him?" Thomas asked. "I want to educate him," Garth corrected. "There's a difference." An hour later, the unlikely group made their way to the Grand Magnolia Hotel. Word had somehow spread through Franklin's efficient grapevine, as it always did in small towns, and a small crowd had gathered outside the hotel. Not a mob, but a collection of curious residents who'd heard whispers that something significant was happening. Sarah Mitchell was behind the reception desk when they entered, and her face lit up when she saw Garth. "Oh, you came back. I'm so glad. I felt terrible about last night." "You have nothing to feel terrible about, Sarah," Garth said warmly. "You were wonderful." "Is Mr. Blackwood in his office?" Patricia asked. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, then looked confused. as she noticed the group of people with Patricia. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's about to be much better," Patricia said. "Sarah, would you please call Mr. Blackwood and ask him to come to the lobby? Tell him I need to speak with him immediately." As they waited, more people began to gather in the lobby. Some were hotel guests curious about the commotion. Others were Franklin residents who'd heard rumors and wanted to see what was happening. The elegant space that had seemed so cold and unwelcoming the night before now hummed with anticipation. Richard Blackwood emerged from his office wearing another expensive suit, his expression irritated at being summoned. He stopped short when he saw the group gathered in the lobby, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Garth. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said stiffly, "what is the meaning of this? And why is this individual back in our establishment?" "Mr. Blackwood," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authority of ownership, "I'd like you to meet Garth Brooks." Richard's expression remained unchanged. "I'm sorry, who?" "Garth Brooks," Patricia repeated. "The country music singer. The man you threw out of my hotel last night because you judged him by his appearance." For a moment, Richard's face showed no recognition. Then, slowly, understanding began to dawn. His superior expression faltered, replaced by something that might have been panic. That's impossible," he stammered. "Garth Brooks wouldn't be dressed like... He wouldn't look like..." "Like what, Mr. Blackwood?" Garth stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Like a working man? Like someone who's traveled a long road? Like a human being who just wanted a place to rest?" The lobby had grown completely silent. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to hold its breath. Richard struggled to find words. "I had no way of knowing." "You had no way of knowing because you never bothered to look past the surface," Garth said. "You saw clothes and made assumptions. You saw someone different from your usual clientele and decided they didn't belong." Richard's face had gone from pale to red. "Sir, if I had known who you were, you would have treated me differently?" Garth interrupted. "And that's exactly the problem, Mr. Blackwood. A person's worth shouldn't depend on their fame or wealth. Every person who walks through those doors deserves the same respect and dignity, whether they're a celebrity or a janitor, a millionaire or someone just scraping by." The crowd in the lobby had grown larger, with people pressing closer to hear the conversation. Sarah Mitchell stood behind the reception desk with tears in her eyes, while Thomas Wilson watched with grim satisfaction. "Mr. Blackwood." Patricia stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of hospitality tradition. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Please clear out your office and leave the premises." "Mrs. Hawthorne, please," Richard began, panic now evident in his voice. "I can explain. I was just trying to maintain standards." "Your standards," Patricia cut him off, "are not my family's standards. The Grand Magnolia was built on the principle that every guest deserves courtesy and respect. You violated that principle in the worst possible way." "But he was dressed like a vagrant," Richard protested, desperation making him sound shrill. "How was I supposed to know?" "It shouldn't matter how he was dressed," came a voice from the crowd. It was Harold Patterson, stepping forward with his wife at his side. "We were here last night. We saw how you treated that man, and it was shameful. Shameful." "The measure of hospitality," Margaret added, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the lobby, "is how you treat people who can't do anything for you. And you failed that test completely." Richard looked around the lobby, seeing condemnation in every face. The spell of his authority had been broken, and he was revealed for what he truly was: a small man who had mistaken cruelty for sophistication. "I'll be speaking with the hotel chain's corporate office," he threatened weakly. They'll hear about this. Please do, Patricia replied calmly. I'm sure they'll be very interested to learn how their former manager turned away one of the most successful recording artists in history because he was wearing jeans and a baseball cap. As Richard gathered what remained of his dignity and retreated to his office to collect his belongings, a spontaneous round of applause broke out in the lobby. It started with Sarah, spread to the Patterson couple, and soon the entire crowd was clapping. But Garth raised his hand for quiet. This isn't about celebrating someone's downfall, he said. This is about remembering that how we treat each other matters. Every interaction is a choice, to be kind or cruel, to welcome or exclude, to see the best in people or to assume the worst. He looked around the lobby, making eye contact with as many people as possible. Last night, I experienced both sides of that choice. I was judged and rejected by someone who saw only my appearance. But I was also welcomed and cared for by people who saw my humanity. Those are the people who represent the true spirit of this community. The crowd listened in rapt attention as Garth continued. Which brings me to an announcement. Tomorrow evening, weather permitting, I'd like to give a free concert in Franklin's downtown park. Consider it my way of saying thank you to a community that reminded me what hospitality really means. The lobby erupted in cheers and applause. People began talking excitedly among themselves, already making plans and spreading the word. Sarah clasped her hands together in delight, while Thomas grinned broadly. Patricia stepped to Garth's side, her eyes bright with tears. This is beyond anything I could have hoped for. Not just the concert, but the lesson. My father would have been so proud. The lesson isn't over yet, Garth said with a smile. It's just beginning. Because tomorrow night, we're going to show everyone what a community looks like when it comes together in the spirit of kindness and welcome. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about the concert, Garth felt a deep satisfaction. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into something beautiful. A reminder that human dignity was not determined by external circumstances, but by the content of one's character. And tomorrow night, under the stars in a small Tennessee town, thousands of voices would join together in song, celebrating not just music, but the timeless values that make communities strong. Kindness, respect, and the understanding that every person has worth and deserves to be treated with dignity. The story that had begun with judgment and rejection would end with acceptance and celebration. And perhaps most importantly, it would serve as a reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons come not from success and acclaim, but from moments of vulnerability and the choices people make in response to them. In Franklin, Tennessee, those choices had revealed the very best of human nature, and that was a song worth singing.